Thank you so much, the moderators of the session, and also the organizers for inviting me. The title, I was close to change it a bit because the noise is not so silent killer. So therefore, this does maybe not fit entirely here. I have nothing to disclose and would like to start with an overview that we generated 2 years ago. So therefore, it's a bit outdated, but in general, maybe one or the other factor moved up or down a bit, but still it's the same risk factors that are here among the top 20. And what I would like to stress here, what makes us sick, the data from the global burden of disease study, is that you have a lot of lifestyle factors with the blue boxes, and you have external environmental exposure risk factors with the red boxes. And you see that even among these top leading 20 risk factors, the majority comes from the lifestyle and the external exposure risk factors. That's what I would like to stress here. And also that's why it's very important that in 2005, Professor Wild introduced the exposome concept, which is the concept that is designed to study all of these risk factors and the health impact by them. So therefore, on the left side, you can see that there is an external environment, a general external environment that comprises risk factors such as climate, noise, urban environment, air pollution, and so on, that you cannot easily influence as an individual. On the other hand, there is the specific external environment, which is mostly defined by our lifestyle, whether we smoke, whether we do exercise. And all of these exposures on us, they interact with the genetic predisposition. Therefore, the mentioned risk susceptibility genes, and also interact with pre-existing chronic disease, making the thing even more complex. And all of this together will then lead central biochemical pathways such as circadian clock, stress hormone, inflammation, oxidative stress, which is usually also measured by gene or protein expression changes using omics methods. And these changes in the internal environment will then cause health effects that we can see in the clinics. So therefore, myocardial infarction or stroke. So coming to noise, the general concept that is really accepted meanwhile is the noise stress concept introduced by Babish in 2001. And there you have a direct pathway that is basically due to sleep deprivation or hearing loss, also leading then to stress responses, but we are more interested in the indirect effects, which is noise-induced annoyance and also neuronal activation mechanisms leading to stress responses. Those will then trigger cardiovascular risk factors such as high blood pressure and so on, which will then lead to manifest cardiovascular disease, and finally the increased risk. If you look at the molecular mechanisms, then it's quite clear that there are two pathways. Noise can activate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, leading to cortisol release, and on the other hand will cause amygdala activation and then activation of the sympathetic nervous system, leading to catecholamine release, noradrenaline and adrenaline. And all of these stress hormones downstream will activate other hormone systems such as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, leading to vasoconstriction, and downstream of that or associated with it, inflammation and oxidative stress. This also has large clinical impact, and there is a quite recent Umbrella Plus review that nicely puts together all evidence that is there. And you see on the left side that across all major traffic sources, you have a clear increase in cardiovascular mortality. In total, it's 4% increase in risk by 10 decibel higher noise exposure. And this higher cardiovascular mortality is mostly triggered by increased risk for ischemic heart disease, hypertension, stroke, and heart failure. And you see overall an increased risk of 3% per 10 decibel noise level increase. In Mainz, the interest in noise started when Thomas Münzel initiated studies in healthy subjects and also coronary artery disease patients that he exposed to one night of aircraft noise, and in the next day did in the clinics measurements of flow-mediated dilation endothelial function studies. And what he found as a central finding is that even the one night of aircraft noise exposure causes impaired endothelial function in healthy subjects, which is even more pronounced in patients with pre-existing coronary artery disease. Also already indicating that obviously the vulnerable groups suffer more from noise exposure than the healthy population. The measurement was done by flow-mediated dilation that probably all of you, I think, will know, where hyperemia-induced dilation of the vessel can be measured by ultrasound. And we found a clearly dose-dependent narrowing of the vessel. So therefore 30 aircraft noise events narrowed a bit and 60 aircraft noise events more. And this was prevented by pre-administration of vitamin C, which is known to protect the essential cofactor of endothelial nitric oxide synthase, tetrahydrobiopterin, from oxidative breakdown, also suggesting a role of oxidative stress in noise-induced damage. We then translated the human exposure scenario to a mouse model that you see on the left side. We used somewhat higher mean sound pressure levels of 72 decibel, which is roughly the sound that you experience when a car passes by, and we had peak levels of 85 decibel, which is roughly reflected by a truck passing by. So therefore quite high, but we also only exposed the mice for 1, 2, and 4 days, so therefore short term, but found profound effects. So therefore there was a clear activation of leukocytes in the bloodstream reflected by oxidative burst in response to noise. There was uncoupling of endothelial nitric oxide synthase. There was nitration of proteins as an oxidative stress marker. And there was also a clear increase of the stress hormone noradrenaline and also downstream of that the vasoconstrictor angiotensin II. This was translated also to functional consequences. So therefore, throughout the exposure period, we found increased blood pressure. Also from the first day, a clear endothelial dysfunction, impaired nitric oxide bioavailability, and also supersensitivity to vasoconstrictors such as noradrenaline or endothelin 1. So noise is very important in our opinion. That is also why the European Research Consortium MARKOPOLO that I coordinate for Mainz, where the acronym MARKOPOLO stands for Markers of Pollution, and also of course refers to Marco Polo the explorer, because we want to discover new ground in environmental research. And this EU consortium consists of 15 partners and has a total funding of 9.3 million euro. So therefore, we hope that we can really contribute something to the field within the next 4 years. And what we are highly interested in Marco Polo is, for example, the impact of noise on vulnerable groups, as done here by one of our partners, Martin Rösli, with colleagues, looking at the effect of noise in patients with diagnosed acute coronary syndrome, and then reporting and finding that the noise causes a steeper increase of the hazard ratio for recurrent events or death in the ACS patients as compared to healthy subjects. Therefore, clearly indicating that patients are at higher risk for noise damage. Also, there's a lot of animal research going on in Marco Polo. For example, in the past, we did noise studies in mice that are hypertensive, had a myocardial infarction, or were diabetic, and looked for the additive effects of noise on top of that, and also could report additive effects. Marco Polo now also, for example, looks for noise effects in mice with Alzheimer's disease, and there also explores the brain-heart axis. Then we did in the past intervention studies against noise, for example, using alpha-beta blockade, thereby preventing catecholamine dependent adverse effects on the cardiovascular system. We employed antioxidant systems such as NRF2 and hemoxygenase 1 activators, and very recently also used centrally acting drugs like diazepam and citalopram in order to prevent neuronal activation already at the beginning, and could then also show that downstream of that the cardiovascular events damage by noise is prevented. Okay, then also another big topic in Marco Polo is the interaction of noise with other environmental exposures, especially, of course, particulate matter or ultrafine particles. We did one study on this in the past in mice, where we co-exposed mice to noise and particulate matter 2.5. And we found that noise, of course, acts mostly on the brain, whereas the particles act mostly on the lung. But interestingly, we found additive effects in the vascular system and the heart, and also in blood circulation, as you can see by the heat map on the right, where you clearly see that each single exposure has a certain effect by changing from green to red color. But if you have the combined exposure in the last column, you see that almost everything is red, clearly indicating that there is an additive effect. And this was also done by a colleague of Marco Polo, Mette Sørensen from Denmark. She uses the Danish national cohort with more than 5 million health data sets, and she could show by using the high resolution exposure maps in Denmark for air pollution, noise pollution, and lack of green space, that there is indeed a cumulative risk increase if you have all the 3 different exposures there. And this she showed for type 2 diabetes risk, also for stroke risk, and also for myocardial infarction risk, clearly indicating that in the future we should really focus on multi-exposure scenarios rather than to look at single exposures only, because one obviously increases the impact of the other. Then also Marco Polo, together with other consortia within the EU cluster Expo HealthNet, of course, will try to produce policy brief documents to help the politicians and decision makers to do better health policy regarding environmental risk factors. And here you see example that these policy brief documents, they are very compact, very short, really sell the facts that are important, and usually they contain highly informative infographics, as you can see on the right side, that puts together the main facts in one single page. And then there are key messages, and key messages of, for example, of this very recent noise policy brief was that at least a fifth of the European population is exposed to higher noise levels than recommended by the European Noise Directive. And if you apply the more stricter World Health Organization noise directive, then it's even 1/3 of the European population. Then also You see in this document that road traffic is the most prominent among the traffic sources, affecting more than 90 million people in Europe. In general, noise is at the position number 3 regarding the health threats in the world, just after air pollution and climate effects. Then you see that it really causes a lot of new cases of cardiovascular disease, stroke, and other detrimental events. It also causes 4.5 million of severe sleep disruption and more than 16 million of noise annoyance reactions. In the end, or in summary, 1.3 million healthy life years are lost every year in Europe due to noise exposure. And this also creates a huge financial burden to the European Union of more than 90 billion euro per year. So therefore, what do we need for prevention of adverse health effects by noise? First of all, and this is also the case or the reason why you don't find noise in the global burden of disease study and also rarely find it mentioned in clinical guidelines, we do not have global noise exposure maps and information, and this prevents that this risk factor really becomes very prominent and also important and makes it to the global burden of disease study and also to clinical guidelines. So therefore, the first step would be that we need these global high-resolution noise exposure maps. Then we can do high-quality association studies around the world and at the national level. And this will then trigger in the end that it will also be introduced in the clinical guidelines. So far in the global burden of disease study, only occupational noise is mentioned, but not traffic noise per se. And all of that will help that the legal limits that we already have recommended by the World Health Organization and the European Union will really become legally binding, because so far it's just a recommendation. Yeah? So therefore there is no real punishment if you exceed these levels. And that this at the moment happens, you can see with the upper part of the text here. There's really a quite unique thing going on at the moment, that environmental risk factor position paper was published in all leading journals in parallel of the leading cardiology societies around the world. So therefore it was published in European Heart Journal Circulation and Journal of American College of Cardiology. I think this is really quite a unique case so far. And therefore, I'm quite confident that this will help, that the noise risk factor will soon also be implemented in clinical guidelines. What we could gain if we mitigate noise exposure is if we just would stick to the recommended noise level or limit, then we could save 60 to 70,000 lives every year in Europe. Also, physical exercise and intermittent fasting are clearly preventive against noise damage. And finally, also cardiovascular drugs will help, especially the vulnerable groups, patients with pre-existing cardiovascular disease. And this could clearly also save a lot of money, as shown here, also for a study in Switzerland. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, thank my group for their excellent work during the last years, Professor Münzel, who's still active as a senior professor, and my new director, Professor Philipp Lurz in Mainz, all our funding agencies, and would like to raise the interest of on an upcoming meeting in Mainz that we will have in June this year, that is also dedicated to environmental exposures and lifestyle. Thank you very much.